You're dying. Right now. And I know it may be uncomfortable to even listen to somebody else talk about death, let alone think about it yourself. But it is vital, literally life important, that we have this conversation. So let me push your buttons and tell you that right now, sitting there in your seats, your life is slipping away, second by inexorable second. And one day, those seconds will be done. Your heart will stop beating, and your family and your friends will mourn, and the essence of who you really are will go wherever it is we all go when that happens, but that day is not 1,000 years from now, and it's not 100 years from now, and it might not be 10 years, or 1 year, or maybe not even 2 days from now, but that day is real, and we will all die. And between that day and this one, we are living, breathing, moving, feeling, organic, fallible, wonderful people. And by our daily choices, we're capable of love and joy and greatness. And part of being human, part of being alive, is understanding and accepting the sometimes uncomfortable but absolutely irrefutable fact that we are all dying. All the time. We have this mistaken notion that we live and then we die. But the truth is we're living and dying at the same time, all the time. The only time the dying process stops is when the living process stops as well. In her Wall Street Journal article in September, Cathy Butler said, "We say we want good deaths, but act as if we won't die at all. We've forgotten what our ancestors knew, that preparing for a good death is not a quickie process to save for the panicked ambulance ride to the emergency room. The decisions we make, or refuse to make, long before we die, help to prepare our pathway to the final reckoning." So if I were to ask you to envision the preferred version of your own death, most of you would say something like this: I want to live a full life, get to a decent old age, maintain as much independence as possible, be as pain-free as possible, and then, say it with me, die in my sleep. That's right. That would be okay. That would be a good death. And that sounds like a great plan, but here's the deal. There's no guarantee on any of that. As a hospice nurse, I've helped people who are facing the last weeks and months of their life to maintain some measure of independence and to find comfort and peace so they can die well. And along the way, they've taught me how to live well. And the main lesson is that living well, living fully, simply means embracing life a little bit more each and every day. And the first step is to stop running away from and avoiding death. This is Walt. Walt was 98 years old, and he asked me how long he had left to live. And I said, Walt, I'm not sure, but I'm wondering what you think. And he was quiet for a moment, and he said, well, you know, my mother lived until she was 102, and I'm pretty sure I'm tougher than she was, so I'll live to at least 102. Well, it was just a few weeks later, he started telling people that he was 100 years old. Now, Walt wasn't senile, he was just hedging his bets on reaching 102, right? He was getting ready. And a few months later, his son-in-law, very devoted guy, came to me, seeing Walt decline more and more, and he said, Keith, isn't there something we can do? Can't we get him to 102? And I said, look, even if we could, what then? Would you want to shoot for 105? 110? How old would be old enough? Well, we agreed that old enough isn't ours to decide. And he learned to be okay with that because Walt was okay with that. And because living a full life, that is in our control. And for Walt, at 98, that meant telling his stories and being with his family. And he got to do all of that. And he didn't run from death. So often we do, though. Despite the evidence all around us, our pets die, our family and our friends die. The seasons change, our bodies change. But when it comes to dealing with death, we act like toddlers. You can't see me. Or like teenagers, la, 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 not listening, la, la, la. But that denial, that avoidance, that can't stop the inevitable. It can't even delay it. But what it does delay, and even stunt, is our ability to engage in fully living. You know, for many people, death is full of unknowns, and it seems so final. It's just this dark, dark, scary place. The funny thing is, we seem to prefer to stay in the dark. We don't want to get out of the seeming safety of our beds and cross that darkened room and flip on the light switch to see what it's all about. Part of the reason is because we're scared. We're afraid that halfway across the room, groping our way along in the dark, that's when the monster, death, will reach out and grab us. But I think if we dig a little deeper, the real reason we don't want that light turned on is if we stay in the dark, we can hang on to that self-comforting idea that maybe that monster isn't really there after all. But when that light gets turned on, when, not if, when that light gets turned on, we'll see death, and it will see us. And then we'll have to do something about it. And that is scary. I understand that. I really do. And so I'd like to help. Let me introduce you to a few more hospice patients and their families. For the most part, I won't use their real names or their real pictures, but these are real stories. These are real people. They've seen death, and they've allowed it to see them. They've dealt with it by getting to know it. And I'd like to pass along to you what they've taught me, how to live with it. So if you'll allow them today, these hospice patients and families will come to stand at our bedroom door, and their stories, their truths, will open up that door just a crack, just enough to let a little bit of light in from the hallway. And as our eyes adjust, as our vision adapts, we'll see what they saw, that it's okay. And in that less scary place, we'll see how to fully live. So the first thing we see, the first lesson we learn, is the importance of having conversations that matter. I had the privilege of caring for Debbie and Steve. Debbie was in her mid-50s, and her heart was failing. She spent most of her day sitting up in bed watching TV, because that's all she had energy for. One day, Steve sat down and he asked me a question about Debbie's health and what to expect. I forget what the exact question was, but I gave him a straight answer, and that prompted Debbie to ask a question of her own about what to expect as her heart and her body shut down more and more. Well, after just a few words from me, it quickly became a conversation between the two of them, and I was just a silent observer. And as their talk grew more intimate, Steve shared how scared he was, because he was going to have to finish raising their kids all by himself. And Debbie shared how guilty she felt because she was abandoning them. And she went on to say how difficult it was to share this with him because she didn't want to burden him, make him any more depressed than he already was. And Steve agreed this was tough stuff to talk through, and he didn't want to burden her. I mean, she had enough to worry about. She was the one whose life was coming to an end. Well, before long, all three of us had tears in our eyes, and that was when they started to say how much they loved each other. So I stood up, and I said, okay, that's my cue. I'm going to go. But you two, please keep this up. This is wonderful. Thanks for letting me be here. Before I go, I've got to ask you, this has seemed so healing and so important. How often do you get a chance to talk like this? And they just looked at me. And Steve said, well, Keith, we talk all the time, but we've never talked like this. They'd both desperately needed to talk, but they'd both been avoiding the topic that was staring them in the face for months. They've been trying to protect each other and themselves from trying to deal with this stuff. But they realized that day that they didn't need protection. What they needed was permission to have conversations that matter. And when they started having those, they became more connected than ever. And they shared new life together for a couple months until Debbie died. But they both expressed deep regrets that it had waited so long. Like us. It's like we treat life like cramming for a midterm exam, or waiting until the morning it's due before we actually sit down and begin writing that research paper. You know the word we use for that? Deadline. We think we'll have more time later, but years ahead are not guaranteed to us. Now, Sabrina thoroughly enjoyed music therapy services when she was on hospice. Most of our patients are in their 50s or older, but younger people die too. And every day, families face the harsh reality that their kid's life is ending way too soon. We've all heard it said, It's not about the number of breaths you take, it's about the moments that take your breath away. And I think if we learn to pay attention, those breathless moments, they're all around us. They're not nearly as rare as they seem. That's the second lesson we learn. The second thing our eyes start to see as they finish adjusting to the light. Folks, there are no throwaway moments. Every moment counts. Another music therapist I work with got to spend time with a 4-year-old boy. Brian was dying of a blood disease, and his parents focused every last minute of his life on living. They arranged with a neighbor to donate a crane and bucket system so he could take a ride up into the treetops and fly into the sky. One day during a music therapy session, his dad recorded him singing his favorite song, Life is a Highway by Rascal Flatts. And in between verses, he stopped and just spontaneously began listing the people most important to him. I love you, Daddy. I love you, Mommy. I love you, Sister. And his dad got every word on video. You know, it's incredible to listen to a 4-year-old at the end of his life sing. If we really listen, that mundane soundtrack to an animated movie becomes deeply profound. Life's like a road that you travel on when it's one day here and the next day gone. Out of the mouths of babes. Well, they followed Brian's wisdom, and they made the most of every opportunity to do the things that he loved to do. Now, they still had to set limits and parent him. He was still a 4-year-old, but they treasured every second. At the same time, they somehow managed to honor the sadness. It was beautiful to witness. And what if we do get more time? Well, over our years, life has a way of refining us, of shaping us, of wearing away the non-essentials until all that's really left is who we really are. Sometimes a hospice patient will say, okay, I've only got a little bit of time left, so I'm going to suddenly change everything about who I've always been. And in my last few shining moments, I'm going to become the person I've always wished I could be. You know, the deathbed transformations are amazing, but they're really rare. And you want to know what's even better? When someone has chosen to live their life fully, when they come to the end of their days, whether they're 4 or 54 or pushing 102, they already are who they've always wanted to be. And that's the third lesson we learned. The third thing we see as our eyes finish adjusting to the light. We'll die the way that we've lived. So I've got to tell you about Gloria. She was a Red Hat lady, longtime member of the Red Hat Society, and part of their mission is for members to realize their personal potential and to celebrate life at any age. Gloria was no exception. If you've ever known a Red Hat lady, you know they put the vi in vivacious, right? I mean, they're always dressed to the nines, always have their face on. Well, Gloria was very near the end of her life. It had been a few days, almost a week, since she had had anything to eat or drink. She was essentially asleep the whole time, comatose, non-responsive. My time with the family was spent around educating them, saying, you know, she's got hours, maybe a day or two left. Well, before she died, her best friend came to visit. And she and Gloria's daughter tiptoed into the bedroom and stood at the foot of her bed, just stood there, quietly, in her presence, just being with her. And in that quiet, sacred moment, Gloria's best friend leaned over to the daughter and sort of stage whispered, you know, I've never seen her like this. Without her hair and her makeup, she doesn't look good. And the daughter agreed. I know, yeah, she doesn't look good, yeah. Well, we know that hearing is one of the last senses to go, and so Gloria began to shift in bed, previously completely unresponsive, and so Gloria's daughter and best friend leaned in expectantly and watched as, eyes still closed, Gloria slowly raised one hand up from the bed, and even more slowly lifted a single finger to them. Only it wasn't her pointer finger. And then with a smile on her face, slowly lowered her hand back to the bed. One of her last communications with her daughter and best friend was to flip them off. Well, they were dumbfounded for a minute, and then they just started cracking up laughing, because that was Gloria. She died the way she lived. And those were precious parting gifts that she gave them. love and laughter and a little piece of herself right there at the end of her life. She was who she was. She didn't need anything else. She already was who she'd always wanted to be. And that brings me back to us. We're dying right now. And if we're open to that maybe uncomfortable fact, then as we stand in the light of these people that have gone before us and the other speakers with whom I've shared the stage today, as we stand in this new light, we'll see that we already have permission to have conversations that matter. And each day, we have thousands of opportunities to see that every moment counts. And in the end, we'll get to die the way that we've lived. So the question we're left with is this. When you get to the end of your life, whenever that may come, who do you want to be? And what will you choose to do today in order to become that person just a little bit more than you were when you woke up this morning? Thank you.